Welcome back GCSE students and subscribers. Today I'm moving on to consider the Geekonomics predictions for the exam paper for Unit 2. So if you've watched my video with regard to Unit 1, you will know what this process entails. So I shall not bore you with the details once again. Let's get straight into it and see where the gaps lie in Unit 2 and where the likely areas of assessment might be. One thing I must say, a note of caution before we crack on with this, and I forgot to mention it on my Unit 1 video, this is of course just a series of predictions, and as with all of these things, I would recommend that you certainly have a good understanding and knowledge of everything on the specification. But what I'm pointing out to you here today is potential areas which might be more likely than not to appear on the exam. Okay, I hope that's useful. So we're on Unit 2, which is of course the macro unit, and let's get started on this one. So first little section is to do with the objectives of government policy. Now you'll know, I'm sure, the key macroeconomic objectives: low and stable inflation, low unemployment, a favourable balance of payments, sustainable economic growth. Having looked at the previous number of scripts, the only one of these objectives which has really been assessed in the last 3 sessions is actually this one here, to do with economic growth. And so all of the others are fair game for a question in the summer. So full employment, price stability, target 2.0, I'm sure you're aware of, for inflation in the UK, and exports and imports, the balance between exports and imports, making that favourable for your own particular economy circumstances. Of course, a surplus might be appropriate for one country and a deficit for another. It all depends. It's that old economic statement, it depends upon. And then the next point, understand a combination of policies that can be used to achieve an objective. And again, that really hasn't been tested that much, with the exception of economic growth, so policies that can generate economic growth. And indeed, just looking here at my notes, which I made earlier today, supply-side policies have been tested on 2 of the last 3 papers, which is slightly unusual maybe. So I wouldn't say don't learn supply-side policies, but maybe it's more likely this time that you get something on fiscal or monetary policy. Okay, so that's objectives covered. Let's move to the next one. Economic growth. Now, as I've said, economic growth has been covered a lot lately. So in one of the papers, it talked about defining a recession, so 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. Show how economic growth can be measured with reference to GDP. Distinguishing between GDP and GDP per capita, that was on last year. Identify and explain the causes of economic growth. So identify has been done, explain has been done, but not the evaluate the causes of economic growth. So maybe that's something to consider, the pros and cons of various methods to achieve economic growth. Identify, explain and evaluate the costs and benefits of economic growth. So again, identify and explain has been done recently, but not evaluate the costs and benefits. And then finally, looking at my notes here, this is where the supply-side policies came in. Evaluate policies a government can use to achieve economic growth. So in 2 of the last 3 papers, the question has cited specifically supply-side policies and how supply-side policies can be used to achieve economic growth. And the other one, so that would be 2 of the 3 papers, and the 3rd paper asked how income taxes could be used to achieve economic growth. So there is room there, of course, to ask you maybe about monetary policy and how monetary policy could achieve economic growth, given that that hasn't actually been used before. Or maybe the flip side of the fiscal policy coin, if they've asked about tax before, maybe you'll get a question asking you, well, what can the government do in terms of government spending to achieve economic growth? So that's something worth considering. And remember, when we look at these evaluate statements, evaluate, those are potential long answer questions, your extended answer part Ds. So they're your 8 markers, and that's really what sorts the men from the boys in that respect. And let's move on to the final. So this is the final section on part 1 of unit 2. And what have I got here? Well, actually, I have hardly any notes made here on this section of employment and unemployment. So this is an area which I would certainly be genning up on and making sure I had a lot of knowledge about this. The only real question on this in the past 3 sessions was to do with the closure of a steelworks. I think it was in Redcar actually, not too far from here. And you had to explain what the impact would be on the local community. And of course one of the impacts would be unemployment, but specifically then zooming in on the types of unemployment, specifically structural unemployment, where a particular skill becomes redundant and people then find it difficult to move into other occupations. So I would certainly be genning up on this. And look here, we've got another evaluate. Evaluate the consequences of unemployment and evaluate policies the government can use to reduce unemployment. So again, policies, fiscal, monetary, supply side, and consequences of unemployment. So obviously you'll be thinking about, well, tax receipts fall, unemployment benefits go up. There's all the whole sort of the social aspect of it. People don't feel good about themselves, they feel demotivated. It can lead to certain areas going into complete decline. So all sorts of problems with unemployment, which I'm sure you've studied and you're revising hard. So that's part 1, and you're either going to get an essay on economic growth or unemployment, because that's where your evaluate statements lie. There's no evaluate statement here, so it's got to be one of these 2 areas. Okay, so let's move on then to... Oh, sorry, I've got that wrong. There's one final section under here, which is hiding sneakily, ladies and gentlemen. On the next page, there it is, price stability. Now, what's been asked here on price stability? Number 1, what's meant by price stability? And inflation, that's been asked. What's the CPI? That's been asked before. This hasn't been asked. Identify and explain the causes of inflation, including cost push and demand pull. So that's your 3rd bullet point there. That's not been asked before. Evaluate the consequences of inflation, including costs and benefits of price stability. Now, that has been asked in part. So the costs part of that was asked for discussion, but not anything to do with benefits. So there's potential for a question there. And then finally, this last point, explain and evaluate policies that government can use to control inflation and achieve price stability. Now, that has been asked before, control inflation and achieve price stability. That has been asked before. And remember, of course, there's this whole notion of the target, 2% plus or minus 1 symmetrical target for inflation. And then another thing which was asked on this one was the paper presented the candidates with all of the key macro indicators. So 1 for inflation, 1 for growth, 1 for unemployment, 1 for trade. And then you're asked to comment on the so-called health of the economy. So that's something to bear in mind, that you might be given a whole group of the indicators and then be asked to comment. So there are a few areas, aren't there, ripe for essay. You've got these particular evaluate statements here, which haven't really been assessed that closely. You've got the ones on economic growth on the previous page, and you've got the ones on employment and unemployment. Okay, so that brings us then to section 2. So we'll be moving into, obviously in the exam paper, this would then be moving into question 2. Okay, this section, government income and expenditure, this really has not been assessed at all in any great depth. So there was a question about the different areas of government spending and simple identify two areas. We would say NHS and infrastructure or something like that. And the final point here with regard to explaining the economic impacts of changes in indirect and direct taxes. So make sure you know the difference. Direct taxes are taxes on income and wealth, such as income tax. Indirect taxes are taxes on goods and services. In this country, that is VAT, value added tax at 20%. So that has been asked, but the bits in between haven't. So main sources of UK government revenue, distinguish between direct and indirect, straightforward question, but hasn't been asked before. So do bear that in mind, ladies and gentlemen. Next section, the redistribution of income and the correcting of market failure here. So understand what's meant by distribution and redistribution. That's been asked before. Understand why income is unevenly distributed. That's been asked before, but not wealth. Here's one primed for a question. The difference between progressive, proportional and regressive taxes. That's certainly worth looking out for. Explain how the redistribution of income and wealth can be achieved through taxation and government spending, including transfer payments. So that question has been asked in part because there was a question about tax, but nothing about government spending and transfer payments, and that might link in to this top section as well. So again, quite a lot there. So we had a lot of blanks really in this particular section. You need to be brushing up your knowledge. And then lastly, make sure we've got this right, yeah. Lastly, on this particular section, correcting market failure. Now, the whole notion of negative externalities with regard to cigarette smoking, that's been asked. And then a follow-up question to that on the paper was, well, tell me how taxation could be used to nudge people away from consuming the cigarettes, or identify other policies that can be used to reduce consumption of cigarettes. But of course there are all sorts of other things that you could be asked here. So maybe one about pollution, one about congestion charging, toll roads, reducing the price of public transport, all these sorts of things you need to be thinking about. So this really is, there's a lot here in this section which, ladies and gentlemen, to be quite honest and frank, there's a lot of this is still up for grabs. So you really need to have a good, thorough knowledge of this section. And then we move to the last section. Section 3, fiscal, monetary, supply side policies, and then conflicts in policies. Okay, so moving through these. There's been hardly anything at all, with the exception of the questions I've talked about before on taxation. Not a lot really on budgets, surplus, deficit, all that type of thing. It might be reasonable to assume that you'll get that, given that your Unit 3 paper, so much of that is on trade deficit. So you might expect them to try and maybe confuse you and trip you up here. Don't be the person to fall into that trap. Somebody will, I'm sure, but let it not be you. Make sure that you know the difference between a budget deficit and a trade deficit. So that's really all up for grabs. Monetary and interest rate policy. Now, those of you, the smart cookies amongst you, will know there is a link between interest rates and the exchange rate. Now, the interesting thing is that if you look on the previous papers, whilst the exchange rate is not in Unit 2 at all, no mention of it, it's in Unit 3, there were questions on one of the last 3 years' Unit 2 papers all about exchange rates. So that's something worth bearing in mind. When you're revising monetary and interest rates, also think exchange rates. Now, you will do that anyway because exchange rate is figure 2 in the Unit 3 pre-release, so let's not worry too much about that, but that's just worth noting, I think. Now, with regard to this again, hardly any of this has been covered. None of these bullet points really, with the exception of this last one about how the interest rate could impact on the economy, but nothing more on, and actually the specific question was, tell me how the interest rate can be used to lower the level of unemployment. But of course the interest rate policy can be used to control lots of different things, particularly inflation obviously, but also then further impacts on growth. So you've got to have a really good knowledge of these policies, because again this is wide open. I couldn't really say one way or another where the questions are going to come from here. I've mentioned before, moving on, that supply side policies have been asked twice on previous papers, but again, you know, let's not sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater here. You've got to know these, because you just never know. You just never know. It's been repeated twice, could be thrice. And then finally, this question about conflicts of policies. So I'm sure you'll know what we mean here. So if you try to stimulate growth in an economy, it can generate inflation. If you try to stimulate growth in an economy, it lowers unemployment, so that's a good thing. If you try to stimulate growth in an economy, especially one such as our own, we suck in a lot of imports, and so our current account deficit gets wider, as shown on figure 1 of the Unit 3 pre-release stimulus material. So you need to be really up to date on the policy conflicts in that regard. And again, ladies and gentlemen, I couldn't say hand on heart that a question is going to come up specifically on X, but I hope that gives you an idea at least as to the types of questions that have been on the papers in the past, and where there are potential gaps, and at least things which have been covered before. At least you have a sort of knowledge of what those are. I do recommend that what you should be doing is download the previous 3 years' papers for Unit 1 and Unit 2, download the mark schemes and just go through them and just see what the types of questions are, because number 1, you can see where the gaps are, but number 2, questions do get repeated, and so if you know that mark scheme inside out, there's some very easy marks for you. Okay, ladies and gents, I'm going to leave it at that. I hope your revision's going well. If you've got to the end of this, as ever, well done, and thank you for watching right through to the end. If you're not a subscriber, please do subscribe, or follow on Twitter at G_economics. If you want to send me any questions, I'll do my very best to get back to you. geeconomics.co.uk/contact. And I think that's it. So bye for now.